Today I'm in the racing room with Rowland White to talk about all things mosquitoes and planes. The sort of mosquito that was a plane designed by Geoffrey de Havilland rather than the annoying mosquitoes that sting us on holiday. Rowland, thank you so much for joining me, and I suppose unexpectedly perhaps I know a little bit about mosquitoes because of the wonderful story of Geoffrey de Havilland making his first flight from Highclere in 1909, which failed in 1910 when he cleared the ground. So that man has become a hero of mine and a man about whom I've read and researched quite a lot to produce my own booklet. And I feel so proud of the connection. So I'm thrilled you're here.
Well, thank you so much for asking me along. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. And that Geoffrey de Havilland connection is a sort of wonderful pretext for doing it as well. I hadn't realised until looking into it that biplane number 1 crashed and he never got off the ground. And then biplane number 2, with some modifications and improvements, led to his first flight. So that through line from Highclere to the Mosquito is undeniable. And I mean, very soon after that, Geoffrey de Havilland's aeroplanes were flying in the First World War, and then there were the sort of private machines that he built between the wars, then the Mosquito. And I mean, it could be argued even that the RAF itself owed a debt to Geoffrey de Havilland because it was his aeroplanes that they were flying through the 1920s on these sort of imperial policing jobs that sort of allowed them to maintain their independence.
He was an extraordinary man, and he says at one point when he's asked, probably by a journalist later in his life, of all the things he's achieved in his lifetime, and by then he'd also achieved the Comet, what was the best moment for him looking back? And he said, I don't know if you know this, it was the first 4 inches that I cleared at Highclere in September 1910.
Oh, how fantastic.
So it was extraordinary. And his father, I don't know if you know, was rector. Lord Carnarvon was rector up at Cruxeaston. Lord Carnarvon loved cars, and I suspect he used to give some of his old cars to Geoffrey and his brother, who were great mechanics and engineering. And funny enough, Lord Carnarvon followed a degree in French and mathematics, which was unusual in his time. He liked engineering practicalities, and he thought the car was the car of the future. And then he was very keen to try out the planes and go up in them. And Maud Brabazon came to stay here in Voisin, and Farman became a friend in France. And obviously Geoffrey de Havilland was then knowing that Maud Brabazon was here and nicked his shed after he said he didn't need it because he was going to Sheppey, and began his career there. So I discovered this story in a backwards fashion because in 2010 we welcomed 100 tiger moths landing in the field from which he took off. It was one of the best days of my life.
That must have been amazing. I mean, even here in the racing room, obviously we're surrounded by paintings and photographs of horses, but there's a de Havilland moth of some description on the wall there with Lord Carnarvon. So that connection's very apparent even in here.
And when the 5th Earl, who watched de Havilland and who took photographs of his first flight, sadly was very ill in Cairo. I don't know whether you know, but his wife, Almina, rented a plane from Geoffrey de Havilland to make the journey down to Cairo to try to get there in time to save her husband's life. So she took off from Croydon, and we've got the make and the plane she took off on, and she took a doctor with her. And they hopped down. She found it very uncomfortable and was rather sick. Sure. But they managed to make it down there. So she flew from here to Paris, caught a train down to Marseille, and then picked up the plane again to fly across. So she was determined to get there as soon as she could. And so Geoffrey de Havilland played a part.
He facilitated that.
In that part of her life.
Evidently, the stories are stitched together then in a fabulous way. Makes it even more appropriate to be able to join you today. But I gather that there were 2 mosquitoes crashed in the grounds of the castle during the Second World War. Is that right?
There were. So I've become a passionate aviation historian, if you like.
Join the club. Congratulations.
And it's been a crazy part of my life. So having realised, I firstly found a B-17 had crashed when I was completing a book on World War II, and that began the start of the next party of my journey into aviation. And as part of that, I found that 2 Mosquitoes had indeed crashed because the southern part of this estate was requisitioned by Bomber Command and used for pilot training.
Right.
And there was the remains of another Anson in the bottom of a valley, and they would sweep in from Southampton, flying south to north up this valley. And obviously in the early parts of the war, some of the Mosquitoes, I think that the tail mechanism wasn't as strong as it was later become.
Right.
In turn, I think in 2 separate years, 1942 and 1943, the Mosquitoes didn't make it up the steep valley, and they didn't clear the trees at the top, and each crashed in more or less the same position.
Oh, really? It sounds as if it's something similar might have happened in both circumstances.
Before we go any further, do you want to explain what the Mosquito plane was?
Well, it was Geoffrey de Havilland's masterpiece. He had, as I mentioned, built biplanes through the First World War. Between the wars, he was largely concerned with general aviation and building airliners. He didn't have much truck with the War Office or the Air Ministry, who he felt continually changed their specifications. And so he was excluded from the rearmament process largely. And every time he tried to join one, he was sort of pushed away. And he at the same time wanted to contribute to the Second World War, and so built the Mosquito as an entirely private enterprise initially. They built a single prototype in top secret conditions, with some support by this point from the Air Ministry, in a hangar outside Salisbury Hall, which is where Winston Churchill had lived briefly. It's a home just outside St Albans. And it was a sort of Goldilocks aeroplane. It was perfectly sized, perfectly powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to operate as both a successful, fast bomber that relied on its speed and altitude to keep away from the Germans, but also small enough and maneuverable enough to be a very effective night fighter and ground attack aircraft as well. So it was really not just a jack of all trades, but a master of all trades as well, and served without there being any really appreciable difference in the way that it looked from a year or 2 into the war all the way through to the end, with great success.
Because I think it was the fastest plane in the air during World War II. How fast was it able to fly then?
Well, it could reach 400 miles an hour or more, and until right at the end of the war, with the introduction of things like the jet-powered Messerschmitt, the Mosquito, in certain circumstances, could show a clean pair of heels to anything that the Luftwaffe had in their arsenal, which is a remarkable achievement for a machine that first flew in 1941.
And it was made out of...
Well, it was made, of course, we didn't mention that. So it's so easy to forget the obvious. It was made out of balsa wood and plywood. Yeah, I mean, one of the Geoffrey de Havilland were experts at building machines out of wood. And it sort of suggests that somehow it was harking back, but it was not. It was absolutely modern and robust and strong, but critically, using wood meant that you weren't drawing on precious aluminium and materials that were required to build Lancasters and Spitfires and Hurricanes and the like. And so using the techniques that they'd perfected through the 20s and 30s, building these airliners and private airplanes, they built this extraordinary warplane, then built a fleet of wooden war machines that we hadn't seen the like of since the days of Trafalgar.
Quite extraordinary. And I gathered that the Germans didn't like them at all because they felt the bullets went straight through them or something.
Well, I mean, Goering hated them. He said they made him green with envy and sort of would rant and roar at the heads of the German aviation industry that they couldn't do anything with this machine that the British were building in piano factories, of all things, furniture factories. And he said, look, we'd be better off just building Mosquitoes ourselves. And he had particularly good reason for hating the Mosquito, in that on the anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the Nazis coming to power, he was going to be making this huge speech to sort of an elite group of officials to celebrate and mark the occasion. And on the second that the clock struck 11 and he was supposed to begin his speech, Mosquitoes, 3 Mosquitoes had flown, which had flown all the way from the UK, dropped bombs over Berlin and daylight, with impunity, untouched by either the anti-aircraft defences or by the fighters, and all made their way home, and completely ruined Goering's day, completely ruined the Nazis' day. And that was part of what led to the Mosquito's legend. And interestingly, the very young navigator who led that mission is somebody who I then was able to follow throughout the book I wrote.
Yes, which was absolutely fascinating. But, I mean, what an extraordinary plane to fly. And it's in some ways been sort of second fiddle to the Spitfire, which I also love as a plane and was remarkable. And the sound of a Spitfire coming in overhead, which it does here for a couple of different events every year, is still something for which everybody standing here, 5,000-6,000 people, turn their heads to watch in silence and look for this tiny pinprick in the sky coming towards you. And yet I always think, wow, there was also the Mosquito. Yeah. And it's not just an also-ran, it was a very important plane.
No, by no means was it an also-ran. And one of the things, I mean, I should profess the same enthusiasm for the Spitfire as you. I mean, who hasn't? I mean, it was impossible to grow up as I did through the 70s and not be sort of imbued with a love of the Spitfire and the Hurricane and also the Mosquito through movies and books and commando comics and the like, and also the memories of my parents who had lived through the war. But what I discovered when I was writing the book, and I had felt that in publishing terms that perhaps the Mosquito had been overlooked compared to the Spitfire and Hurricane and the Lancaster. What I discovered very quickly was that if the Mosquito wasn't somebody's favourite aeroplane, it was always their second favourite aeroplane. And so actually I found that I was talking to a huge number of people with enormous enthusiasm for the Spitfire, for the Mosquito, and that was as an increasingly great pleasure as I worked on the book.
So what drew you to write a book about the Mosquito?
Well, partly it was this feeling that people had missed the obvious. We'd had best-selling books by James Holland and John Nichol about Spitfires and Hurricanes, the Battle of Britain and the Bomber War as well. And yet somehow the Mosquito hadn't, latterly at any rate, enjoyed its moment in the sun. And I'd always been aware that there was this story of an attack on the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen in Denmark late in the war that had been used as the inspiration for the fictional story of 633 Squadron, Frederick Smith's best-selling book, subsequently hit movie with that incredibly evocative theme song. And so I started looking into that and realised that it really was an incredible story, and decided that was what I wanted to write because it was right at the end of the war. It allowed me to tell the sort of development, the evolution of the Mosquito to the point where it was capable, and the pilots and navigators capable of flying a mission that demanding, which was not true at the beginning of its career. In fact, it was regarded as a disappointment very early on in its career. So, and that was just solely a question of the wrong tactics being used.
So was it really, what year of the war did it come to be in major use?
I mean, it first flew after the beginning of the war, and there were very few successful aeroplanes that first flew after the war had already started. But it's interesting that that Mosquito raid on Berlin happened within days of the fall of Stalingrad to the Russians. It happened. There was another raid on Copenhagen at the same time, and so we're looking at really it coming into its own over the last 3 years of the war. And not playing a part in
the Battle of Britain.
No. Oh no, yes. Absolutely not. I mean, it could show a Spitfire a clean pair of heels when it flew as a prototype, and that surprised everybody. It impressed the Americans at the same time as well. But it was really the last 3 years of the war where the
the early ones that crashed here were probably 1942, I remember Steve Bohill-Smith, one of my plane, he flew Concorde for British Airways and flies Tiger Moths, and he said there was some problem with the tail of the early Mosquitos. So that was probably why. I know one crashed in 1942. I think the other early in 1943.
Okay.
So I presume there were learning curves from that, hence my question.
That certainly sounds right. And in fact, the very first Mosquito prototype, when it was sent to Boscombe Down for testing, didn't augur well for what obviously subsequently came to pass, because the tail on that broke on landing at Boscombe Down, and so it probably sort of reinforced the view of the naysayers that building an aeroplane out of wood a modern aeroplane out of wood was no way to win a war. But obviously, it proved the doubters wrong. But no, you're absolutely right. That there was a known point of weakness early on with that tail, but it just needed some strengthening for it to become, the legend that it became.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, have you always been interested in aviation?
Yes, and I'm not entirely sure why, except for that point about growing up in the 70s and being surrounded by, I suppose, a pride in this country of what our aviation industry had achieved, not just in helping the Allies win the war, but subsequently as well. And the 70s was the era of Concorde as well, and that was tremendously exciting. My granny lived near RAF Wattisham in Suffolk, and so when we went to see her, Lightnings and Spitfires would fly over. I mean, it all just seemed tremendously exciting to a 7 or 8 year old boy. And I think my love of and airfix models, of course, as well. My love of aviation really stemmed from point when as young as I can remember being, and I loved aeroplanes, and it's been like that ever since. Perhaps I put it to one side a little bit when I was a teenager, because even I realised then that it wasn't slightly bit cool to be too much of an aviation geek.
Yes, no, I think my foray into aviation has started that much later, but I have become so fascinated by the courage and the bravery of someone like Geoffrey de Havilland, who made the plane here out of piano wire and the top of a sort of supermarket shopping trolley, it looks like.
Bicycle bits and pieces.
Bicycle wheels and piano wire, and his wife sewed the wings, and he'd never seen a plane fly.
No.
So I just find it completely extraordinary and so courageous that he actually then took off in it and then steered it round, and I mean, how amazing, and then landed it. I mean, absolutely unbelievable.
And persisted. I mean, as you say, that first flight took tremendous amounts of courage, particularly given that his first flight, his first experience of the airplane had nearly killed him.
Yes.
But he went and improved it and built a second one. But with every subsequent flight, he was trying something he'd never done before, flying higher, flying faster, flying further. Every flight in those early days counted as an experimental flight. And it took tremendous bravery.
It did.
And of course...
and also flying in their flat caps and their brown brogues, and
but also wicker chairs and things like that. I mean, it was
and then taking his wife up and then his baby. I thought I couldn't believe that.
No, I mean that was the very youngest first flight, wasn't it?
It was.
And obviously his son subsequently became a test pilot and who flew the Mosquito for the very first time. I mean, I love the story of these early Mosquito flights out of a subsequent ones out of a field at the back of the hangar that they built them in. But they immediately realised they had a war winner on their hands, because it just performed like nothing else. And then Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., we'll call him, Geoffrey named his eldest son, Sir Geoffrey named his oldest son Geoffrey as well, would fly these incredible demonstration flights for the great and the good. And then he'd go and do exactly the same thing again with one of the engines switched off, which gave you an idea of how much power the Mosquito had in reserve and what helped make it such a superlative performer through the war. With that kind of power, you could carry more guns, more bombs, escape the enemy. And even carry spies back from Sweden and Denmark, which was, I mean, they carried Niels Bohr, who was one of the nuclear scientists, perhaps the second most famous scientist in the world after Alfred Einstein, and they carried him back when he escaped from Denmark to work on the Manhattan Project. I mean, the Mosquito sort of finds its way into all these incredible moments of history.
Do you have an idea of what drove Geoffrey to make a plane out of balsam wood?
Well, there are two reasons, I think. One is that he knew that de Havilland were perhaps more expert in it than any other aircraft company in the country, or more expert in building advanced, fast, streamlined airplanes out of wood than any other aircraft company in the country. They'd built this amazing four-engined airliner called the Albatross that looked staggeringly modern in the late 30s when it was built. And beautifully streamlined. I mean, it's one of the prettiest airplanes that's ever been built, but it carried 15, 20 passengers, and yet that too was built of wood. The Comet, which you mentioned earlier, these red racing airplanes which won the London to Australia race in the 30s, they too were built of wood. So they were expert in using wood. They knew what they could do with it, what it was capable of, how strong and resilient and easy to repair it was as well. But the other thing was speed. They knew that if they built it out of wood, they'd get the airplane into production and fighting the war perhaps a year faster than they would if they were building them out of metal. And to have the Mosquito fighting on your side for a whole year longer than you might otherwise have done was a critical factor. It might not have survived the development process and the politics. I mean, every airplane, I think George Edwards, the old head of BAC, British Aircraft Corporation, once said, has four dimensions: length, height, width, and politics. And the Mosquito might not have survived the fourth if it hadn't been into production early.
Golly, how extraordinary. And of course, he named all his planes like the Mosquito.
Well, he was such a keen entomologist. I mean, he loved insects and beetles. I mean, he grew up a really keen naturalist. And so, he named all his airplanes after insects.
Which is, but the Albatross, I think you couldn't say
well, that's
quite
not
was
an insect. No,
but that was interesting because that's
an
not
exception.
quite
You're
an
absolutely
insect.
right. Absolutely.
And the Comet, is that applied to a type of insect? I was interested because those two stuck out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, as soon as I was saying that sentence, I had the Albatross in mind as a red flashing light. Really, I mean, they're not all after insects, are they? But then, no, the Comet was an exception, and maybe that was named simply
but maybe
because
he
they
went
were
from Albatross to Comet because those were the two slightly different planes in a way.
And then also, the Comet was this racer as well, and perhaps he wanted to make a distinction between that and the speed that it was designed to achieve and to win races, and the private airplanes, the sport airplanes that he'd made through the 20s and 30s. But both the Comet and the Mosquito, so the Comet and the Albatross were quite different to what he'd done before. But then obviously went back to insects with the Mosquito, and then its successor, the Hornet, was another insect airplane.
Are there any of these planes still left at all? Or?
Well, there are. There's certainly an airworthy Mosquito in the States. I believe there's one in New Zealand. But excitingly, there are two efforts to get airworthy Mosquitoes flying in the UK again. One is largely public supported. It's called the People's Mosquito, and if people want to go online, they'll be able to find it and make donations, and that is slowly being built by an aircraft restoration company here in the UK. Then I believe that there's another one being built in New Zealand where they have some expertise in building Mosquitoes, which is then going to be brought to the UK and will do flights for the public out of Biggin Hill.
Wow.
Yeah, that was my feeling. Wow.
How amazing is that?
Yeah. Where we elbow each other out of the way for the first flight. I mean, I'm desperate to get inside
Ladies
that.
first. No, I'm joking. I don't think it's curiously, I don't really like heights. Right. I have a kind of mixed view. I could not have gone up in that first Geoffrey de Havilland flight from here. I'd have been so petrified. I'd have tipped the whole bloody thing over, I think. But fascinating to watch. And the fifth Earl of Carnarvon, on whose land it was, and the shed, the hangar where he built it was there, and he was watching it, and he'd said, I'm very keen to, go up as well and try this new sort of travel. He was extraordinarily far-sighted for a man who people think was a traditionalist and a man running a state. So it's fascinating how much he facilitated. I'm not saying he was an engineer at all, but how much he facilitated by his general support.
Maths degree obviously showed an interest. As you said, gives lie to the idea that he was rooted solely in tradition and
exactly.
Suggests,
and he was quite eccentric
mind.
And quirky too. He lived outside the box, so that was also quite interesting. So how many factories in the UK made mosquitoes when they were going?
I'm not going to be able to pluck a number out of my head, but and that's partly because there weren't many that would build whole mosquitoes, and quite deliberately so, in that they distributed the production of mosquitoes to as many different locations as possible. So you had a handful of factories, like one at what's now Luton Airport was making them. There was Hatfield as well. But what you also had were furniture factories, piano factories, none of whom had any work through wartime, putting their skilled workforce to gainful employment, making wooden aeroplanes. And they'd make fuselages or wings. But you then also had huge numbers of other companies that would be making components, which would be used, because there were metal components as well in a wooden mosquito, which would be used in putting the final machine together. But that you also had sort of the equivalent, I suppose, of book groups working together in sheds at the back of their garden, sewing the sort of fabric components that were required by mosquitoes as well. I mean, somebody sort of pointed out, the Luftwaffe, they can bomb that factory or that factory. They can't just bomb every Mrs. Miggins in her shed at the bottom of the garden who's contributing the mosquito. So it was a remarkable and very diverse effort to support this unique aeroplane that relied on a huge number of different people bringing very particular skills and capabilities to bear on it.
And how many mosquitoes do you think were built during that period of World War II?
That's one of those sort of factual questions which I really should know the answer to. But it was thousands, and I'm afraid that the exact number escapes me now. But they were built here in the UK, they were built in Australia, and large numbers were built in Canada as well. So it was the production was distributed around the world, and the wood came from all over the world as well. It was Canadian Sitka spruce. There was even an explorer sent off to Central America because they were so worried that the supply of balsa wood would run dry. There was a whole ministry called Timber Control set up on day one of the war to make sure that everything from lollipop sticks to the wooden battens that were used to repair bomb damage on battleships was looked after. And they were set up in Bristol. But they sent an expedition off to Central America to try and find alternative sources of balsa wood. I mean, the efforts that we just don't know about. We often read the headlines of what was done in the Second World War, but there are so many rabbit holes and cul-de-sacs you can sort of disappear into that illuminate the kind of complexity and the richness of the effort that went into winning the war.
Yes, into life at the time as well.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating, the book I wrote about World War II, and I think I keep on being drawn back to it. It's the tiny details I simply adore, and the extraordinary impressions people have of other people too. I mean, there was a Ministry of Carrots, because we also had to grow carrots here. And all the jam was measured out by sugar. I mean, I just found the whole thing completely amazing.
Yeah.
And then what I think the other thing I really loved, as a short digression, was the fact that, of course, all the signs were removed. There were no road signs to go anywhere.
So
and I get lost going from here, usually to Kintbury. There's loads of wiggly wobbly turnings, and I'm trying to find them. And I just don't know how I'd ever have got there in World War II. And my grandpa-in-law had a batman from Yorkshire, so they would never get anywhere because he couldn't find his way at all. So they'd spend 2 hours and use up all their car ration for fuel going round in a circle. And then they just end up shouting at each other. No. So it's those tiny details, and you think, how extraordinary was that? And how sensible, but how extraordinary.
I mean, you had to think of everything. I mean, you mentioned Ministry of Carrots, and I'd mentioned lollipops, which were of concern to timber control. I mean, because the Society of British Ice Cream Manufacturers went to timber control to say we'd like some lollipop sticks for our ice creams, and they were told no. But and then I subsequently found out that now unable to sell their ice creams throughout the war, Walls then gave their ice cream selling tricycles to the nascent Fleet Air Arm fighter direction unit. And pilots would ride around on these tricycles with the sort of blindfolds on, being directed by fighter controllers so that they could learn how to make radar-controlled interceptions before they went off and did it for real in the Pacific against the kamikazes. I mean, the idea that there was a part to play by these sort of redundant ice cream tricycles in Second World War is extraordinary. But as you say, it's those tiny little details that really bring a book to life. And when you start a book, you just never know what you're going to find. And it's the joy of the research is realizing there's a connection between this and this, or discovering that these two ostensibly unconnected events happened on the same day, which gives you a way of sort of pulling a story together. And I mean, when I started the Mosquito book, I just had absolutely no idea of how rich that story on the ground in Denmark was going to be. And that became one of the things which was an absolute fascination to me when I realised that there was one family, or rather two families, who met at a country house in Denmark in the final months before war broke out, whose stories then took us all around the European theatre, including the resistance in Denmark and the requirement to bring those Mosquitoes in to bomb the Gestapo. You then had a prism then with which to sort of tell the last 3 years of the war in a way that meant you were really invested in the fate of the members of these two families. And you always want people to care about, you want readers to care about the people involved and realise what's at stake for them rather than keep throwing lots of names at them.
Yes, no, you certainly do. I found it a completely fascinating book, but my husband was the one who picked it up, right, Geordie. Okay. So he kept saying, "I love this book, this Mosquito, but Fiona, you've got to go and get contact with Rowland White. I love this book." So he wouldn't let me read it to start because he was reading it. We do argue about books. Right. So normally I win, but sometimes I don't win. But it is an extraordinary book, and I think both of us are really proud of the de Havilland connection to Highclere. So it was something which I'm often playing with to try to remind people of the courage and persistence of this extraordinary man. And he was so often fighting his own side to get something through, both First World War and Second World War. So it was extraordinary on that front, and yet he persisted.
No, he did, and as we were saying at the beginning, he was almost excluded from the effort to rearm and modernise the Air Force, and it was only, as you say, his persistence and his belief that he was capable of building an aeroplane that really was going to do exactly what he said it could do and more, and succeed on that basis, which was very much sailing against the tide. The official view was that bombers had to be really big and heavy and be weighed down with defensive guns on the front and the back. And he said, no. If we build a really fast machine that can outrun all the fighters and get to Berlin and back, we don't need guns. And he was absolutely right about it. I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question to ask what the Air Force and that bombing war might have been like if we'd had a force of Mosquitoes. I mean, there was no practical, realistic possibility of that ever happening. Each only had a 2-man crew instead of a 6-man crew. And yet each Mosquito could carry as heavy a bomb load as some of those early models of B-17 flying fortresses. And so They were remarkable.
Which is where my story here, Finding the Planes, began, with a very heavy B-17 Flying Fortress. And then I ended up at the Mosquito.
So we bring the story right back to... I gather there's still a gap in the hedge, is that right?
In the tree line, where the B-17 went down.
How amazing.
Whereas the Mosquito is much harder to find.
Yeah.
So we have a rough bearing. We know the names of the pilots because they were made of wood and therefore lighter when they disintegrated.
And biodegradable.
So for those reasons, that's more of a story, and the B-17 is more seriously there, and there are still the remains of the B-17 on the hillside today, which I suppose is more visibly empathetic. Yeah. And yet the story of the Mosquitoes, or there's also a Lysander that crashed, a Whitley, a Proctor, a P-38, and I've got one more to find.
Really? So there's one aeroplane that you've yet to sort of find a location for.
I think it's a Sea Fury or something, which which is over to the eastern side of the estate.
So that was just post-war, the Sea Fury, I think.
It was. So I think it crashed in. I think it might have been the very end, but and I don't think anybody died in it. Okay. But the plane came down, and often, when they're innovative and new, it's when they're most risky. You never want to fly the innovative and new one.
They weren't blessed with Merlin engines either, which were fantastically reliable. I think
they were extraordinary. And we've got a Rolls-Royce, which we bought back, a Phantom Rolls-Royce from 1936, with these extraordinary engines in. So I love the thing that it's both on the ground, in this case sitting in a garage, and upstairs and upstairs, up above us in the sky, you've got these extraordinary engines. Amazing.
No, I mean, the Merlin was a masterpiece, and that raid that I wrote about in Mosquito against Copenhagen, you had the sort of best of British engineering in the shape of the Mosquito and its two Merlin engines, escorted by the best of American engineering in the shape of the North American P-51 Mustang. Which was a machine that had been sort of limited in its success and ability until somebody had the bright idea of putting a Merlin engine in it. And then the Merlin engine really made the Mosquito, made the Mustang the success that it became. So
a Mustang flew over here.
I did it
when we were doing a charitable day for heroes at Highclere, which is amazing. Yeah. So I want to again in 2025 to think about what our parents and grandparents achieved at the end of World War II, what their dreams and their hopes might have been after VE Day, and to raise money for those who serve and save today. So that's one of my. I'm going to make
for next year.
Yes, hopefully you'll come back
to
that.
No, I would absolutely. I'd love to.
And have some planes in the sky. That's why I was asking you if there were any Mosquitoes, but clearly
there won't
not
be. I don't
then.
think for next year.
I have got some small models of them here, which some of my mad aviation friends have made, which are a joy. And hopefully they can come along as well. And I'm not quite sure how. Some of them are building some bigger Mosquito models. So I don't know.
Well, let's see. I mean, maybe as mentioning the People's Mosquito in this podcast will lead to a run of donations that will see them speed up the completion.
But maybe they can bring it along and track it in.
Yeah.
And then that might also help them.
I'm just, there's a Mosquito that runs on the ground with the engines going at East Kirby. Where there's also a Lancaster, but I think that would be a big logistics operation to bring that down here.
Yes, no, there's always a few problems, but you know what? I always give it a whirl.
No. I mean, exactly. No, problems are there to be solved.
They are, and that's what Geoffrey de Havilland did.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
The Mosquito was the most extraordinary plane. But thank you, Rowland, so much for coming along today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.